Hi, Vix. Thanks for coming in. Let me know if you can hear me. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. I'm pretty good. How are you doing? How are you doing this lovely Thursday? Not bad. Bad. It's like a fancy D there. I hope it only gets better. All right. Can I get this to work? Looks pretty good. Doggo. So today we're going to start the history of Japan in a sort of quick drive-by history because if I start going into depth into all of the different historical periods of Japan, I'll probably bore everyone to death and I'll get way too involved in it. And I really wanted to get to like sort of this traveling through Japan idea, but it's difficult to just jump right into that without having a basic idea of the history. A lot of you probably already have that already, but just in case you don't, this is sort of the quick drive-by, and today I'm going to talk for about an hour and a half. Hopefully I won't put everyone to sleep. We'll see as far as we get with it. I have to the Kamakura period prepared. If I get there, then yay. If I don't get there, it's okay. But I don't want to talk for more than an hour and a half. Usually that, people's attention is probably gone in 20 minutes. But, so that's my goal for today. Starting an approach to basic Japanese history so that we have a background in that. And we'll learn more about this exciting doggo. Maybe we'll learn about this doggo. Maybe we won't. Oh, how did that go? No, that's not what I wanted to do. Here we go. All right. So these are some of the words that we talked about last time. I wanted to include them in the lectures, the PowerPoints, so that if people are watching the YouTube videos later, because I'm going to put these all up on a YouTube channel, mostly for myself, but in case anybody wants to know how these things are spelled, so we have Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, which are the 4 main islands of Japan. Fukushima was that nuclear power plant that we talked about. Sakurajima is a very active volcano in Japan. Shinto was the original religion of Japan, and the Fujisan, Hangu, Sangen, Taisha, Asama temple system is what we talked about. It's a system of temples that all revere Mount Fuji as a kami, as a god. Yabusame was mentioned. That is the horseback archery. And then Owakudani was mentioned. That was the boiling valley where everybody ate the eggs. I did look up how the eggs taste, and apparently they taste exactly like regular eggs, like maybe slightly richer in their taste, but not amazingly different than the hard-boiled eggs that you can make at home. Jigukudani was another one of these, hot spring locations, and it contains the Joshinetsu Kogen National Park, where the snow monkeys live, where you can go see the snow monkeys. Kusatsu was a prime example of a onsen town to visit. That's in the Kanto region. Beppu was another place, onsen town, lots of gardens and pools to look at. Dogo Onsen in Matsuyama is the oldest still operating onsen in Japan. Karahafu was a type of gabled roof over entryways for important buildings. And then, of course, onsen and sento are our last two vocabulary words. Those are the hot spring baths, and then just the public bathhouses are the sento. All right. So that's a brief rundown of some of the words that I said last time that maybe don't know how to spell, so now you know how to spell them. So this is a basic timeline of Japan. Obviously, it can be, even more simplified if you wanted it to be, or it could be even more complex. So today we're going to try to reach to the end of Kamakura. If we don't make it, that's okay. But that's why I have Nanbokucho highlighted in yellow. So that's where we're trying to aim for. We're trying to aim for 1333. Alright. So our first period is Jomon. So that's giant word. This time I typed them in so everybody can see Jomon and see how they're spelled. All of the exciting words. Alright. So, this is the first period that we'll discuss. This is the town of Aomori. It features the Sanai Maruyama excavation site, which you see here. It has a Jomon period settlement recreation. Obviously, these things don't actually still exist from the time period that they were first made, but we have recreations of it so that we can see what these things looked like. The earliest traces of human life in Japan date to around 30,000 years ago, but it is possible that people were there much earlier than that. Crude stone tools have been found at sites in Aichi and Tochigi, that may date back to 40,000 years ago, but we aren't sure. It's very difficult to date, stone tools. We need some sort of organic material in order to date things, whether it's charcoal or pottery or something that was basically, we need something that was once alive in some way or another, whether it's plant or animal. So experts often debate the issue of how long ago did people come over, how long were they making a culture, that kind of stuff. But as we discussed last time, until about 12,000 years ago, a number of land bridges connected Japan to the continent. So we have Siberia to the north, Korea to the west, and possibly even Taiwan to the south may have been connected through the islands to Japan. The earliest identifiable culture was that of the Neolithic Jomon, so Stone Age Jomon, who from about 13,000 BCE inhabited coastal areas, particularly in eastern Japan. And BCE means before Common Era. So we currently live in Common Era, and then before Common Era is the section before the year one, essentially. So before Common Era counts down to year one, and then we started at year one, and then we're counting up to, we're at 2021 right now. It's not an ideal system, but that's what we're working with at this current juncture. Some researchers have a different way of calculating time, but we'll go with what's most used. So the Jomon people lived a quasi-nomadic lifestyle, gathering seaweed and wild mushrooms, hunting deer and bear, fishing, and dry farming crops like taro, which is like a type of yam. Mostly they started to develop small villages in the later period in the Kanto Plain near modern Tokyo. So the Jomon people may have been the ancestors of the Ainu. The Ainu are a racial minority that was pushed northward. These are the indigenous people of Japan. They look very different than what you think of as traditional Japanese people. They have, full beards, much more hairy bodies, that kind of stuff. So this small group of people now live mostly in Hokkaido, and it's essentially an endangered culture. So as we travel to Hokkaido, we'll learn more about the Ainu. Alright. Pottery. Why is pottery important? Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. See, I skipped. Let's go back to that. There we go. Okay, so historians associate the Jomon with a distinct style of hand-formed pottery imprinted with twisted cords. So Jomon literally translates to cord markings. So they would have a stick. They take a stick and then they would wrap a cord around it and then they would roll it over the wet clay surface. And you can sort of see that in this image here, these markings. You can imagine them rolling the stick and making these markings, these like sort of hashtag markings that are happening here a bit. So these vessels and figurines were fired in open bonfire pits. It's difficult to control the temperature of an open bonfire pit, so it's not super easy to make pottery this way. But Jomon pottery is the oldest known pottery in the world. So it's very lucky that we have, some examples surviving of it. So pottery is important for, humans because it allows us to cook and store food. So a lot of the pots created by the Jomon were for cooking, such as this long, simple example that is designed to sit inside a fire. So you'd make your food inside of it or boil your water or whatever, and then it would sit inside of a fire. So this is just one example. Luckily we have a lot of examples of Jomon pottery, and we'll get to look at some of those as we have future meetings. Oh, hello, Tifei. Yeah, that's Tifei. Hello, Tifei and Moonbot. Welcome. Thank you. Let me know if there's any technical issues, like you can't hear me or see me. Last time we had some glitches. Thank you, Moonbot, for making all these notes in the emojis. Welcome. We appreciate you being here. So pottery, we have pottery for cooking and storing food. The main issue is Dapper isn't here. I think he'd probably give his regular excuse of, I am working, followed by a panicked emoji. I am working, panic emoji. So as time moves forward for the Jomon people, pottery changes up a bit, and we get these Dogu figures. So this is an example of a Dogu figure. There are several different styles of these, but this is the most famous kind, and it might remind you of some Pokemon and also Power Rangers characters. It's very famous. These are called Shikoki Dogu, and that Shikoki basically translates to light-blocked eyes or goggle-eyed. So it's kind of like they're wearing snow goggles or something like that. I just saw you asking when I would be home. Oh, yes. I was asking when you would be home. So you could actually, perhaps participate or watch or lurk or whatever you wanted to do and tell me if I have any technical issues. Feel free to lurk if you're still working or you're busy. That, there's no obligation to sit here and take notes or anything like that. Thank you for stopping by. And staying for as long as you can stay. Thank you, Moonbot, for taking notes. So there's a variety of these figures. They don't all look like this, like snow goggle figures. So we'll talk a little bit more about those as well, in future meetings. So we have these kind of trippy figures, and we have this trippy pottery. So the pottery we'll also talk about. There are a lot of interesting examples. So this is the late Jomon period flame style pottery. So you can sort of see that the design of it reaches upward like flame. So that's why it's called flame style. So the amount of work and detail required to put into these pieces, as well as the figure that you saw earlier, indicates that they were probably used more for religious reasons, rituals, ceremonies, rather than just for cooking or entertainment purposes. Because there's no writing at this point in time, we have no idea what the actual purposes of these things are. But, we research our archaeological sites as much as we can, and we come up with theories and things like that. So, as we travel through Japan and we see, we visit some of these archaeological sites and museums and things like that, we'll get into the Jomon a little bit more, so you have a greater experience with these. And even this guy here, he's actually... There's a dog barking outside, so if you hear that, I apologize. This microphone is very good at picking up all sounds, hopefully my voice, but also the dog outside. So this Dogu here, there's a giant version of him that is an entrance to a train station that I'll show you in the future as we travel to that train station in Japan. I should probably have just included a picture of it here. Today, did I remember to do that? No, I did not remember to do that. Alright. So moving on to our next time period. Again, we're just trying to do a quick, drive-by of the beginning of the history of Japan, hopefully reaching 1333. If we don't get there, that's okay, but we're going to talk for an hour and a half. And then I'll slice myself off so I don't bore everyone to death. So the next time period of Japanese history is the Yayoi. That is how you spell that. And an interesting place to learn about the Yayoi is here at the Yoshinagari Historical Park. It's in the Saga Prefecture. It's an outstanding archaeological site. Yeah, I mean, it's very close. It's very close to that word, the meaning of which, hopefully you already know and I don't have to explain it. But no, it's Yayoi, which is a neighborhood in Tokyo, actually. If you live there, it might be an interesting place to get confused. Oh, my avatar is like bouncing all over the place. So like the Jomon archaeological site, the Yayoi archaeological sites often do have these like recreations as well that you can go visit as a tourist. And this is a particularly large park. It covers a very large settlement where we have dozens of pit dwellings, elevated storehouses. So storehouses for grain and food were lifted off the ground in order to prevent pests from getting at them. And there's also over 2,000 tombs here at this site. It is the largest and most important Yayoi period site in Japan. So definitely something that we'll visit as we travel throughout the country. So sometime between 800 and 300 BCE, and again BCE is before Common Era, so before our Common Era that we're in right now, this new culture began to take shape. So there's a lot of debate over how these new people migrated to Japan. Did they come over from the Korean region or the Chinese region, or perhaps both? And how did they interact with the peoples that were already here, right? We already had the Jomon here. How did they interact? Did they push the Jomon upward towards Hokkaido, towards northern Honshu? Did they intermarry? Did the cultures fuse together? Or did they just kill everybody that they encountered, or maybe all three? Again, we have no writing to really give us, clear examples of, what actually happened, and this happened, over a time period. So the earliest known Yayoi settlements have been discovered in northern Kyushu, which is closest to the Korean peninsula, so that may be a clue that they're coming over from that region down into Japan. And now is the part of the lecture where my dog decides to play with toys very loudly. So I apologize in advance for that. It was recommended by a friend that I take his toys away during the PowerPoint's presentations. And if anyone has tried to hide toys from their dog before, you'll know how well that would probably go. So I just leave his toys out because he's gonna make noise and mess anyway. But at least he isn't attacking me for his toys. So by the 1st century CE, and that is Common Era, our era, the Yayoi had spread to the center of Honshu, bringing with them wet rice, agriculture, and metallurgy. So there are theories that they were doing some dry agriculture during the Jomon period, but the Yayoi have, amazing technology that they're bringing over from the mainland. So we have wet rice, agriculture, and metallurgy. So in other words, they have the ability to make iron and bronze tools and weapons. So we're going into Iron Age, Bronze Age here. We have left the Stone Age. We actually have the ability to make more advanced tools. So wet rice agriculture is a labor-intensive process. It demands a more stable settlement. In other words, you have to stay in one place for a long amount of time. So villages were established, and then the population grew. You had more food. People were staying in one place in a stable community. And then these settlements led to territories and boundaries being established. So this, we're going to get more, territoriality, where people want specific lands, lands that are, good for farming, which, as we talked about before, not all land in Japan is super great for farming. There's a lot of mountains and hills and, very difficult to farm that. So farmable land is valuable here. So this culture is referred to as Yayoi after the neighborhood in Tokyo where this distinctive pottery was first found, an example of which you can see here. And obviously hopefully this is obvious to you that it looks a lot different than what we're making in the Jomon period. So Yayoi pottery was possibly formed on a wheel, and it was definitely fired in kilns. So these are two innovations that were most likely brought over from the mainland by these Yayoi migrants. Some historians believe that maybe this is just a different type of non-wheeled pottery. Maybe this is just hand-created. But still, the kilns we know existed, and they allowed for much more control over the heat. So you can have the walls of the pottery be thinner, more delicately made. And we also have two technical differences from the Jomon pottery. The fine clay surfaces of Yayoi vessels were carefully smoothed, and clay slip was sometimes applied over the body to make it less porous, to make it easier to cook in and hold things. So this is an example of Yayoi pottery. We have a lot more examples, but they all have this much more delicate, refined look to them. So with metallurgy comes metal arts, most of which is probably lost to us. The issue with metal is that it melts down and you can make it into other things. So oftentimes, things are like, oh, I don't need this anymore, so I'm just going to melt this down and make a new sword or make a new, shovel for my yard or whatever. So we don't always have metal arts surviving, especially during times of war. Often, this is throughout history, no matter where you are on the planet, times of war come along and you need more weapons, and so you start melting down the statues and stuff. This is typical. So luckily for us, the Yayoi had this practice of burying large bronze bells. We're not really sure why they would bury these things. Probably for a religious reason, but they were specifically buried, not like, oh, they just fell off and they got buried over time. No, they were specifically buried. These bronze bells are called dutaku, and you can see an example of this here. They are clapperless. In other words, they're not designed to be rung. They don't make music or noise. The shape of them probably is derived from earlier, smaller Korean examples that adorned horses and other domesticated animals. So these were buried, sometimes singly, maybe in pairs, or other times in large groups. And occasionally with bronze mirrors. We get bronze mirrors coming over from China in particular, and weapons. So These were put in isolated locations, often on hilltops, away from the general population, away from the farmland and stuff. So this was done like with a purpose. Perhaps it was to ensure a community's, agricultural fertility, or maybe, human fertility. Later, Dotaku have very thin walls. Again, these things wouldn't have resonated, so it's, they were made for rituals. So the most common designs, you can see that there is a design on the surface of this, are hatched lines, triangles, spirals, geometric patterns. We sort of have this like plaid looking texture to the example we have here. But we do also see occasionally scenes of fishing, harvesting, hunting, fighting. But weirdly, these are all familiar activities to, the ancient Japanese. But weirdly, we don't really have religious or ritual ceremonies depicted on these things. So, kind of indicates to us that, it's for, a good harvest, successful hunt, maybe that kind of stuff, rather than, something different. All right. Moving on. We're making good time. Maybe we're making good time. I don't know. Slightly good time. I said I was going to talk for an hour and a half, so we got half hour down. All right. So next we're going to talk about the mythic origins of Japan and the imperial family. Dun, dun, dun. All right. So where does Japan come from according to the ancient Japanese? So the male and female Japanese Shinto deities, Izanagi and Izanami, who we see pictured here, were brother and sister, as well as husband and wife. So this is the ancient mythology, and it's something that, we also see this in ancient Egyptian mythology as well. You have brothers and sisters who also become husbands and wives. This is not unique to Japan. So they come down from the Takamagahara, which is the plains of high heaven. So they come down from heaven to a watery world in order to create land. So Izanagi, he dips his spear, and, if I could move my arms and make quote marks, I would. We'll put spear in quotes, into the water. And as he lifted it up, muddy droplets fell and then solidified as the islands of Japan. So afterward, Izanami and Izanagi, they're going to live there, and then they populate Japan with their offspring, who are a variety of gods. So they have a very interesting series of stories to go along with them, and we'll talk about them more in the future. But for now, on the point of, mythic origins of Japan, we'll talk about Amaterasu. So she was the sun goddess. There goes my dog. Thank you. Thank you, dog. Thank you, Harold, for participating in this. So she's the sun goddess. Her name basically translates to light of heaven. So she's one of the gods created, by Izanami and Izanagi. So Izanagi actually takes a bath, like a hot spring bath, like we talked about last time. And as he's washing himself, many gods are created, and Amaterasu is one of those gods. So a god dedicated to the sun is obviously very important for an agricultural society that depends on sunlight for crop growth. And of course, Amaterasu is our namesake for our Okami dog, wolf thing. That's where the name comes from, is the sun goddess of Japan. So I had to include Doggo. All right. I had to include Doggo. So this image here shows the famous story of luring Amaterasu out of her cave. She was hiding there in order to avoid her brother Susanoo, he was being a royal ass to her, and she was like, I am done with this crap, and she went and hid in a cave. But obviously when the Okami, yes, Okami, so she went and hid in a cave because she was really ticked off at her brother, and we'll talk about that story in the future. It is interesting, but just so you understand what this image is, so if you get the sun and she goes and hides in a cave, it's, probably not good for, life on Earth and crops and things like that. So they're trying to, lure her out of this cave. And here we have the invention of music and dance. So they're trying to entertain her in order to get her out of the cave. And then they hang up a mirror on a pole, which is what you see over here. Is my cursor working? Probably not. Over here, this is a mirror that they've hung up on a pole tree thing in order so that she sees herself in the mirror and is attracted to come out of the cave, because she'll be like, oh, who is that foxy lady? I want to go meet her. And she'll come out of the cave. So she did eventually come out of the cave, and they grabbed her, and then they blocked off the cave so she couldn't return to it. Hello, welcome, Banana. Welcome, Banana. I hope you brought cookies. I hope you brought cookies for everyone. Also, Banana, if you have any technical issues with sound or visual glitches, feel free to let me know. If you can't hear me or anything like that, feel free to let me know. You will hear my dog making a lot of noise. He's playing with toys. He's licking water. All right, thank you. So, Amaterasu's great-great-grandson, Jimmu, becomes the first emperor of Japan, reputedly in 660 BCE. So this is basically saying the imperial family can trace its origins all the way back to this important god. This is really, legend and that kind of stuff, but this is how... Oh, okay, now he's got to whine. Now my dog has to whine. Really? We can't just do one thing? We can't have nice things in this house? You have to whine? Okay, thank you. So, the idea of, the imperial household being divine is an issue that comes up throughout history, for good or for bad. But it is a thing. It is a thing. So we have two written accounts of the Young Empire. The Kojiki translates to the record of old things. This dates to 712. And the Nihon Shoki translates to record of Japan. Dates to 720. So obviously no one is writing about this stuff in the prehistoric era. So this is stuff that is compiled later as the mythology, but the idea is that the imperial family descends from actual gods. Throws limits at Banana. We'll go. I went ahead too fast. All right. Tifa is taunting Banana with math. Please keep the math away from me. Unless it's very simple math that I can Google. So scholars are skeptical about whether or not the first emperors actually existed. So we have a record of these emperors existing in things like the Kojiki, whether or not these people actually were real. There were emperors and empresses too, by the way. So some experts believe that the 10th emperor, Sujin, was the first to really exist, and he was perhaps the founder of the Yamato dynasty, which we will talk about. So different accounts of Sujin's reign place it anywhere from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE, our era now, Now my cat has to make vomiting noises behind me. She has to participate in this by making hairball sounds behind me. Thank you. So, Kinmei, who reigned from 539 to 571 Common Era, is the first emperor of verifiable historical record. So we're pretty sure he existed. According to the lineage of emperors in, what are essentially legends, he would have been the 29th emperor. So either way, the Yamato dynasty is the longest unbroken monarchy in the world. So that is pretty remarkable. So what is this Yamato culture that we're talking about? Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Kat, for adding a lot of sound effects for the show. So according to Chinese sources, which of course are inherently biased, so we should keep that in mind, by the end of the 3rd century CE, there were more than 100 kingdoms in Japan, which were organized into federations. The most powerful of these was ruled by a shamaness queen named Himiko, and you see a statue of Queen Himiko here in front of the Kanzaki train station. Did she really exist? That's another one of these legend, real person questions. But there is a record of her in these Chinese sources. Where exactly Himiko's federation was located, we aren't sure. Perhaps it was in present-day Nara Prefecture, or maybe in northwest Kyushu. Himiko's federation was called Yamatai, but the Chinese called it Wa. By giving tributes, Himiko acknowledged her allegiance to the Chinese emperor. So she would send tributes to the Chinese and be like, I'm friends with you. Please like me. Again, this is a diplomatic process that's written about from the Chinese perspective. So obviously the Chinese are going to be like, oh, she, displayed that she is, is lesser than us in some capacities, showing tribute to us instead of the other way around. So we need to keep that in mind, historically speaking. All right. Oh, wait. No, I wanted to stay in that. See? I've forgotten which thing to click. I have 2 computers with different notes on them, so that's why I keep screwing up. Always have to make mistakes. All right. So there are a lot of interesting theories and legends surrounding Himiko, so she'll probably be an interesting topic to discuss a bit more in future meetings, but we do have some important points to bring up now. The Chinese did not have a huge amount of respect for the Japanese, nor Himiko, as a shamanist queen. In general, it was like they were regarded as barbarian and backward in comparison to the Chinese court at this time period. So one of the records in China is called the Records of the 3 Kingdoms. The English translation tells us that Himiko occupied herself with magic and sorcery, bewitching the people. And another set of records is called the Records of Wei. It describes how when Himiko passed, a great mound was raised, more than 100 paces in diameter. Over 100 male and female attendants followed her to the grave. So as far as I know, researchers have yet to find kinds of mass burials. Basically, it's saying that she died and then they buried a whole bunch of people with her. But, were the ancient Chinese, misinterpreting what actually happened? Did the ancient Japanese really practice this type of thing? We really have no, proof of it. So it's an interesting story, and it reminds us that, a lot of this history is really story in a lot of ways. So we have this legendary federation of Himikos called Yamatai. And we also have this organized political entity called Yamato. So are they related? We aren't actually sure. So Yamato was located in the Nara Prefecture and represents a growing concentration of administrative and military power. Part of Yamato culture was the practice of burying their leaders in mounded tombs. So when the Chinese wrote about, this raised mound tomb that Himiko was buried in, that was actually accurate. So during the Kofun period, the leaders would be buried in these mounded tombs, and eventually they gained these keyhole shapes, and they were surrounded by moats. Their size and shape corresponded to status, so like the richer you were, the bigger keyhole tomb you would have. So this is evidence of a developing material culture, and increasing social stratification. So the leaders are becoming richer, the peasants are probably becoming poorer, and that's how, unfortunately, that's how history goes. So this brings us to the Kofun period. So that's how you spell the name of the tombs, and the time period is named after the tombs. So this is one of these Kofun tombs in Osaka. It's one of the largest tombs in the world. It's actually larger than the pyramids, the Great Giza Pyramid. So this is regarded as the tomb of Emperor Nintoku, who was the 16th emperor, but many historians don't think so. It's the largest one that we know of, so it's kind of like, okay, we'll give it to this really important guy, but we don't actually know who is buried here. So take that with, a grain of salt. So the Kofun period dates to about 250 CE, Common Era, to the early 700s. Obviously, it's named after these tombs, so some of them have been cleared and restored for us today, and we can see them in aerial photographs, and we can see that keyhole shape. Obviously, when they were making these, they were no airplanes, so they couldn't see this shape from the air that we can see today. So some of these are archaeological sites that have been opened and excavated, and we know about their contents, but in general, the majority of these tombs have not been opened. The imperial house protects any tomb that may potentially be connected to the imperial family. So if you see a tomb and you're like, okay, that's the 16th emperor's tomb, you're not allowed to open it. So this is rather unfortunate for archaeologists and historians, but this is, the imperial family wants to protect these sites for, respect and religious reasons as well, of course, because, the emperors are supposed to be descended from gods, from the Shinto gods. So, of course, there are those who, cynical people today, they know that with modern DNA science, we could actually learn a lot about the heritage and bloodlines of these people if we open these tombs and we tested the DNA of these people. But that might not be something the imperial family necessarily wants us to learn about. So there's that. Some, as I said, some have been opened, excavated. We know about some of their content, so we'll talk about that a little bit in the future, about what we've actually found inside. By the end of the Kofun period, these tombs could be found as far north as Niigata, and as far south as Tanegashima, showing the extent of the influence of the Yamato culture, but the largest tombs are found near Nara, sort of indicating that that was really more of the epicenter of this culture. So here you can see a 3D rendering, 3D computer rendering of what the tombs kind of look like and how they were built in these layers in order to, sort of this sloped cake effect. And then you have this, the diorama, the miniature model beneath it at the Saikai City Museum. And this is a model of that Nintoku's tomb. So obviously from the air we have all the trees and the overgrowth, so it's difficult to sort of see what's going on beneath that, and people aren't allowed to go past the gates into the actual tomb areas. No one's allowed into these things. So these types of little, the renderings and the dioramas give us an idea of what they actually look like. So you can see in the bottom example we have these concentric moats. That's what the black coloring is the water moats surrounding the tombs, and then dotting around the actual main tomb you see these like little tombs. So these are probably family members buried around the main tomb. So these were based on earlier tumulus tombs. And when we say tumulus, we basically mean that you create a chamber, you put a coffin in the chamber, and then you mound it with piles of rocks and earth on top of it. And you can see an example of one here. These mounds still exist. These mound tombs, tumulus tombs, exist still throughout Japan. And then these were lined with haniwa. So these terracotta figures that you see here are, they're hollow, and they were specifically arranged on the exteriors of the tombs as some type of display. What this display meant, we're not entirely sure. So you'd get all sorts of different kinds of haniwa. You can see there's this pig example here, and then you have human figures as well down here. So the earliest haniwa they date to about the late 3rd century CE, and they were simple clay cylinders. Haniwa translates to clay cylinder or circle of clay. Then later on we get houses and animals, as well as ceremonial and other objects appearing in the late 4th century, and eventually we get the figural haniwa created in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, and some of these are nearly life-size. Alright, so here's a sort of more up-close image of some of the haniwa we have discovered. And a lot of these things we find in pieces, and then we glue them back together, essentially. So there's a lot of debate around the purpose of these things. Did they protect the tomb? Did they contain the souls of the dead? Were they meant to help the dead in the afterlife? There's a Chinese practice where you would basically, like the terracotta army of the Chinese emperors, you would basically bury the emperor with a clay version of his entire army and his court and all of his belongings in order to accompany him in the afterlife. So is that sort of what's happening here? We're not quite sure. It's a bit of a mystery, but there you get an idea of what some of these look like. Which thing am I clicking? All right, here we go. So we'll talk more about the kofun and the haniwa in future meetings as we travel to, locations in Japan where you can see these things. But if they do look, familiar to you, there is a reason. Especially if you watch Ghibli movies, which you can see, Princess Mononoke, little figures, very much, derived from these types of haniwa figures. And then we have the gyroids from Animal Crossing, and the gyroids are very much deliberately based upon the haniwa figures of the kofun era. So there's a reason why they look familiar. So back to our boring history lesson. The Yamato did have their challengers. The culture did have its challengers. Throughout these early centuries, rival chiefdoms within the Yayoi culture made power plays of their own. And then there were also what historians call the Epi-Jomon people, who had resisted the Yayoi culture altogether. These were likely descended from the earlier Jomon people, and they lived in northern Honshu, and they traded with people like of Hokkaido and stuff. So the Yamato court called the Epi-Jomon people the Emishi, and they fought to subjugate them in wars that continued until the 8th century. So it wasn't like a totally, completely peaceful time. Alright. Oh, no. I skipped ahead. There we go. Moving on. Here we go. So during the mid-5th century, writing, and thus record keeping and reading, was introduced to Japan by Korean scholars from the kingdom of Baekje. So you'll hear more about Baekje and the other Korean kingdoms as we move forward. Just like Japan, Korea was not one solid nation state at this time either. But this writing was initially just Chinese. And then later we have the Japanese language captured in the Chinese character system. So they tried to basically, take the Chinese characters and assign them to Japanese sounds and write Japanese that way. This is obviously a bit awkward and unwieldy because the Chinese character system is so complex. And as time moves forward, other character systems are developed that make writing in Japanese a bit simpler and faster. So we have kanji hiragana mixed, which you see here, which is a mixture of the Chinese kanji and then the hiragana characters, and then later on we get the katakana characters as well. And you can see that these characters are sounds. They're not like one letter like the alphabet that we're familiar with in the United States, where you just have A, B, C, D. These characters represent sounds. So today we see all three of these being used, and it makes for an interesting learning experience if you want to learn how to read and write Japanese. So we'll probably talk more about the language and the characters and things like that in future meetings. All right. I just realized that I didn't eat at all before I started this. How many times have people started that themselves? They start streaming and they're like, wait, I forgot to eat. So our next time period is Asuka. Okay, currently we're at 5:02, so I'll talk for about half an hour more. And we won't get to Kamakura most likely, but we'll get through this early history stuff. So this is the Asuka period. In general, a lot of Japanese time periods are named after the location where that was sort of the center or capital of that culture. So that's, Asuka is, again, a city, basically. So during the Asuka period, the idea of a united Japan comes ever closer to becoming a reality. We should remember the mountainous terrain of Japan and keep in mind that this did not encourage one solidified kingdom, but instead it was more natural to have lots of little separate clans ruling small territories. Travel and communication throughout Japan was not as easy as it is today. You have to go over all of those mountains to get to your neighbors. That's not fun. So the most important thing that happened during this period was the introduction of Buddhism. This is an Indian religion that took hold in China, Korea, and then later came over to Japan in the 6th century. It was introduced to the archipelago by the Korean kingdom of Baekje again. So Baekje is obviously important for us. And it considerably transformed the Yamato culture. Buddhism didn't replace Shinto. Instead, they fused together in various ways because they were really complementary systems. Like my mouth does not... Is my mouth moving? There we go. Hello. So Buddhism discusses the best way to live life. It talks about what is the afterlife, reincarnation, things like that. But it doesn't really prevent people from practicing both religions. The simplest way to explain the rather complex amalgamation that occurred between the two is that kami, the Shinto gods, became Buddhas, and Buddhas became kami. So Buddhas are, people who study and become enlightened, basically. So each kind of fused together to the other. We have kamis that are now Buddhas, and Buddhas become kami. So at this time period, we also see kami given a human form, such as in this scroll painting here with our friendly deer. Prior to the introduction of Buddhism, kami were not shown in art as human forms. So these are 5 Shinto deities, which you look at them and they could be Buddhist Buddhas, but they are Shinto deities that are now shown as humans. All right, moving right along. Wait. Okay. So the Buddhist religion itself was noteworthy for the cohesive worldview it presented, but also powerful were the attendant technologies. For example, architecture to create temples, like the example you see here, and skills to create statues, both of which conferred on the Yamato court an undeniable gravitas. So Buddhist rites were incorporated into the increasingly elaborate pageantry of courtly life, and the era of Kofun building was over, as Buddhism practiced cremation. So the more Japanese people that became Buddhists, the less we see those types of mound tombs. So imported concurrently with Buddhism were increasingly sophisticated techniques of statecraft that would serve to bolster the strength of the Yamato state. So probably our most famous ruler during this time period is Prince Shotoku. He lived from 573 to 620. He is the powerful regent of Empress Suiko, and again, we do have empresses at this time, and she lived from 592 to 628. He was an early champion of Buddhism and founded the temple Horyuji, there we go, which you can see here. It was founded in 607. These are some of the oldest wooden buildings surviving in the world. The pagoda, which is the multi-layered building that you see here with its many stories. The main pillar of this pagoda was felled in 594. Because, trees were once alive, we know that we can actually, date these things. So that is the temple that he founded, an example of the type of architecture that is developing at this time. So Shotoku also enacted the first of a series of administrative reforms based on Chinese Confucian principles that regulated land distribution, official court ranks, and the penal code, the punishment code, the criminal law. And this was called the Ritsuryo. It laid the groundwork for a bureaucratic society with a strong centralized government. From the 7th century onward, the court sent emissaries to the Tang Dynasty China to further study Buddhism, government, medicine, and art. So obviously, Shotoku and the Asuka period were very dependent upon what's happening in China, and the Tang Dynasty was very powerful and influential. So Japan was like basically, hey, we want to be like them so that they don't take us over, right? You see your neighbors are super powerful and super refined, and they have this like system down pat for governing their land and their people. You're like, oh, I guess we need to do that too, and keep up with the times. So the Buddhist sculpture you see here was actually commissioned by Shotoku. He had a terminal illness. He didn't know it was terminal, but it was his terminal illness, and he commissioned this in order to like pray for to not be to be healthy again and not be ill anymore. And that is an example of the type of art that was being commissioned at this time. All right, moving on to the Nara period. Let me click the right computer. Alright. So 20 more minutes of me torturing you. Dun dun dun. So large portions of Japanese history are defined by political rivalries involving assassinations, military coups, civil wars, etc. Much of what is documented is who is trying to kill who. Like, we'd love to have like a really in-depth, fascinating social history, but we have to dig a lot for that kind of stuff. What is more readily available is essentially, war and conflict. That is much more readily researched. So after Shotoku's death, other clans systematically murdered the Soga clan leaders. So he was part of the Soga clan, and logically they would gain control over the throne. But the other clans were like, no way, we're gonna kill all the Soga clan leaders so that none of them have any power, and basically it becomes obsolete, and that is what happened. But cultural exchanges with China do continue, and the Japanese government becomes more and more centralized, like the Chinese model. So large landowners were renamed as government officials when their properties were nationalized, and a system of taxation was put into place. In 701, a penal code and administrative system known as the Taiho Code was established in Japan. And again, this is based off of the Chinese model. So a lot of what was being done in the prior Asuka period and what was being done by Prince Shutoku, that still continues, even though the Soga clan is no longer in power. So for centuries, Shinto tenets on purity had ordained that the court relocate following the death of an emperor or an empress, So this is for, basically like sort of cleaning our aura or something like that, but also it allows for like an entirely new court to be established in many ways. However, in 710, a permanent capital was established at Nara, and you can see what this looked like in our little scale model here. So this was known as Heijo-kyo at the time, and the city was designed on the same grid pattern as the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an. Today, this is the Chinese city of Xi'an. It demonstrates to us how influential Chinese culture was upon the Japanese court. If they look at the capital city of the Tang Dynasty and they're like, "Ooh, we want to make that too," So, during the Nara period, the divisions of the imperial bureaucracy grew exponentially and hastened the swelling of the city's population to probably about 200,000 people. By this point, Japan's total population is estimated to be about 5 million people, and it is developing more into, what's going to be our nation state. All right. So one result of the strong central authority of the Nara period was the construction of magnificent Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines that dwarfed those previously built. You need organization, you need money in order to make these kinds of things. So the expansive park at the center of Nara today, which is very famous because all of those deer wander around Nara Park, and you can go feed them, and you can go be attacked for your deer cookies at Nara Park. It is the site of the largest and most important of these Buddhist temples, and it's also within this complex is the Shinto Kasuga Shrine, as well as the Buddhist temple Todaiji, and the Great Hall of Todaiji is pictured here. So obviously, hopefully you're catching on that just because you have a Buddhist temple doesn't mean you can't have a Shinto shrine right next to it, and vice versa. That's pretty normal in Japan. Again, these weren't really conflicting religions. So what you see here in the picture is actually a smaller reconstruction of what once existed initially. The original was lost to fire. Japanese cities have this issue of constantly being burned, and Kyoto, and Nara and Tokyo, I'm just going to make up a word, Tokyo, we're not immune to this. So Todaiji, the original Todaiji was burned, and it's about, so this is a smaller scale version of what was once there, because when they were going to rebuild it, there were no longer enough old-growth cypress trees in the entire country to recreate it at its original scale. So they had to scale down, essentially, because there just wasn't enough trees. So the original Todaiji was finished in 752. It was built as a focal point for the government and its people, and to ward off a smallpox epidemic that was happening at the time. The temple is symbolic of the Buddhist theocratic state that reached its peak during the Nara period, and the Nara period dates from 710 to 794. And yet the court did not totally relinquish its older Shinto belief system. In fact, it doubled down on it, compiling record books that traced the lineage of Yamato's emperors, all the way back to the realm of the native Shinto gods, as I said before, with the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are two examples of this. So, Shinto was not thrown out the window. It was equally treasured and embraced as much as Buddhism. So here is that was our Great Hall at Todaiji. And here we have the reconstructed giant Buddha in the main hall there. So inside that building is this giant Buddha statue. So only some large bronze carved lotus petals survive from the original Buddha the statue that was here before, because yes, the statue basically did melt in the fires. Hello Josh, welcome. Thank you for visiting us, Josh. We're here for about 20 more minutes, and we'll learn about the Nara period and the Heian period here in Japan. And this is sort of a quick drive-by of Japanese history, just so that if anybody is totally clueless about, the basics of Japanese history, they'll learn about it. And my dog is about to bark at stuff happening in the hallway. Harold. There we go. 1 minute. 1 minute. All right, we're back. I'll just make all the dogs bark. Hopefully you can hear me again. I muted myself in order to put him in his crate. He'll probably still bark from his crate, but yeah, anything happening, he's got to be like, hey, I'm on this. So this is the reconstructed Buddha. So Emperor Shumu, who ruled from 724 to 749, conceived Todaiji as the headquarters of a vast network of branch temples throughout the nation. Todaiji served as both a state-supported central monastic training center and as the setting for public religious ceremonies, the most spectacular of which took place in 752 and celebrated the consecration of the main Buddhist statue in a traditional eye-opening ceremony. So the statue is a giant gilt bronze image, and it was inspired by the Chinese tradition of erecting monumental stone Buddhist statues in cave temples. So the eye-opening ceremony was presided over by an illustrious Indian monk. He came all the way from India, who painted the Buddha's eyes, and that's what the eye-opening is. So you have this monk who comes and he has this religious ritual where he paints the eyes, and the statue it comes alive. So we also had foreign dignitaries and religious figures from all over the mainland of Asia come to this ceremony. There was sutra chanting by 10,000 Japanese monks, and there were also performances by 4,000 court musicians and dancers. So this was the Olympic, opening ceremony of its day, essentially. It was really, Emperor Shomu showing how refined and powerful and wealthy his government was, right? So numerous ritual objects used in this eye-opening ceremony came from a variety of Asian and Near Eastern lands. So the resulting cosmopolitan atmosphere reflects the position of Haejo-kyo, or Nara as we know it today, as the eastern terminus of the Central Asian Silk Road. So this is a good point to remember that even though we have Japan as an archipelago off the coast of Asia, it is not cut off from the mainland and has no idea what is happening there. Again, that, as we talked about previously, that that changes throughout history. Sometimes we have more isolation, sometimes we have more of this globalization, and it goes back and forth throughout Japanese history. All right. So we'll move on to Heian period, and this is our last period for today, because I don't want to go too far over. I wanted to reach Kamakura and reach the end of Kamakura, but we won't reach there. But Kamakura comes after Heian, so we're close. We're close. So this is how you spell it. Hey. All right. So this is our new capital city of Kyoto. This is a map of what it looks like today here on this side here, and then above my head, behind my head, is a map of Edo from 1849, and that is, I'm stuck. Okay. And that is Tokyo. And you can see if I move my head, no, the other way. No, okay, I'll just bend down like this. You can see that Tokyo is basically created like a spider web. It is a castle city. Oh, you can see them better that way. It is a castle city, and you have the castle at the center of the city, and then you have this like web of streets working out from it. So the entire point of a castle city is usually to get you lost. They want to get you lost. They don't want you to be able to like follow a gridded street system to the main castle so that you know exactly how to get there and exactly how to attack it. You know, like that is not the main idea. So Tokyo is very difficult to navigate for many reasons, and that is one of them. Kyoto, on the other hand, is like Nara, and it was designed on that same grid street system as that Chang'an capital of the Tang Dynasty. So by the end of the 8th century, the Buddhist clergy at Nara had become so powerful that Emperor Kamo decided to move his whole capital in order to escape it. They were so influential that he was like, the heck with this, I'm picking up and moving. So he first settled in Nagaoka, which is today a suburb of Kyoto, but following several inauspicious disasters, he relocated the capital to Heian-kyo, and that is what we call today Kyoto. Sorry about my dog making noises, if you can hear that. Here the capital would exist for the next 1,000 years, so the location was ideal. It was surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. The site was both a natural fortress and a perfect embodiment of the principles of Chinese geomancy that were in vogue at the time. So Chinese geomancy, you might be like, what is that? It is Feng Shui, and Feng Shui is probably more familiar to you. Feng Shui holds that if you bury a person in a properly sited grave, facing the proper directions, his descendants will prosper. And this applies to the siting of houses, cities, and whole regions. You know, the way that they're set up works either for good or for bad for their inhabitants. So this is why Kyoto, Heian-kyo, was modeled after Chang'an again. So this was an exclusive insular world that revolved around the court. Interestingly, the court had no practice of executions. Like if you pissed off the court members really badly, they would just transfer you to the provinces, and that was essentially punishment enough. It was as good as being dead. You're kicked out of the court, you get sent to the hinterlands. Geomancers are one of my favorite job classes in video games. Okay, so you know all about geomancy then. So yes, divination, that kind of stuff. So it's been estimated that the number of courtiers and courtesans hovered around 5,000 to 7,000 in Heian-kyo during this time period. So you include their family members, servants, and the necessary merchants and artisans to run a city. It's likely that the population of this capital was at least 10 times that, so probably 50 to 70,000 people. All right, moving on. Let me click all the things. All right. So court rank was largely determined by bloodlines, and it meant everything. So during the prior periods, the Asuka and the Nara period, they really tried to do the Chinese system of you would take tests. So it was merit-based, and that's how you would get your court rank. But in Japan, that quickly kind of fell apart, and then it was basically became who you were related to, and that determined your court rank. And it's important because what your rank was determined what clothes you could wear, what kind of house you could build, what kind of servants you could have. Could you have a mistress? Could you have two mistresses? All these things were all court rank. And high-ranking clans were granted untaxed estates called shoen, and which they derived their wealth from these things. Yes, it's very pretty. This is probably one of the prettiest buildings in Japan, the Phoenix Hall, and that's saying something because there's a lot of pretty buildings in Japan. So the land of these clans would be worked by peasants, and then they would get their money from, the agricultural, what was grown in the land, but it wasn't taxed by the court. So that was, lucky for them. And in the Heian period, interestingly enough, women could inherit land, and this gave them a degree of independence, something that we will not always see in many periods of Japanese history. So also during the Heian period, purely Japanese styles of Buddhism developed in the esoteric Shingon and Tendai sects. So we'll talk more about these types of Buddhism and their related art and architecture in the future. But in addition to those two, we have a third sect of Buddhism that came over from the mainland at this time. It is called Pure Land. It offered a more immediate and easy means to achieve salvation, i.e., an existence in paradise after death, than the elaborate rituals of the esoteric sects. So you didn't need to work quite so hard in order to, gain access to paradise. So this was, appealing to many people. So here you see the Phoenix Hall of Byodo Inn. And this is a Pure Land temple in the Uji Mountains outside of Kyoto. So the entire complex was once a secular palace, and secular means non-religious, created for a member of the powerful Fujiwara family. Welcome? Yes, did you study for the test? I don't think there's a test today, but there is a lecture. Welcome. So it was a secular palace, and it was created for a member of the powerful Fujiwara family that advised and controlled the imperial court, So there's this tradition of these powerful clans essentially controlling the court, and not necessarily the imperial family itself having a lot of power. So upon his death in 1052, the family converted the entire palace into a memorial temple to honor his spirit. So now it is basically a Pure Land Buddhist temple that you can visit. All right, moving right along. So in 894, as China's Tang dynasty was beginning to collapse slowly like a flan in a cupboard, and political tensions in Heian-kyo were at a high, the imperial court ceased its practice of sending emissaries to China. As the Tang powerhouse basically dissolved. Thank you. Thank you. There's really not a lot of text. But there will be a VOD. Yeah. Or you can borrow notes, yes. So as the Tang dynasty basically fell apart, it became rather unsafe to travel to China. So a lot of people just stopped going. And Some people did still go, but as far as if you were going to send a political envoy over there, it wasn't necessarily a safe, good idea. So for the next several centuries, Japan turned inward. From isolation was born a rich court culture. So that, this is really the first inklings of what we consider to be Japanese culture today, and it is defined by refined aesthetic pursuits. So one example of such pursuits was the writing of diaries and stories by the Heian court ladies. They didn't write in Chinese. They didn't have to. It wasn't required of them because they weren't court officials. They weren't Buddhist monks. So they wrote in Japanese instead. And this was much more manageable to read and write. And so they would create these stories and then pass them amongst themselves, essentially. The most famous of these stories is the Tale of Genji. It was written in installments around the year 1000 by court lady Murasaki Shikibu, and that is a pen name. That is not her real name. So it tells of the romantic exploits of a handsome prince. His name was Genji, and he was removed from the line of imperial succession, but he continues to live, a rather rich, aristocratic life as an imperial officer. So he's not going to get the throne, but he can still live a very posh existence. Yeah, please go to the bathroom whenever you need to. So this is regarded as the world's first novel. Hello, welcome. Because it was written in installments, can we actually call it a novel? We're not quite sure. Thank you for following. But it is regarded as the world's first novel, and it was written by a woman. So Murasaki herself inserted herself as a character in the story, and you can see that in the image. So this is the character Murasaki in the story. And many works of art throughout subsequent centuries tell the story of the entire novel in paintings and in scrolls and that kind of stuff. So you can see this in many works of art. The Tale of Genji. As an example, here's one work. So there's a misunderstanding about a letter playing out in this image. So there are many chapters to the Tale of Genji, but in general, they focus on who is in love with who is sleeping with who is cheating on whose heart has been broken, who's murdering who, and then who has control of the throne and the court, and so on. So there is some debate on how many of the chapters are actually original. But even if they are the product of multiple authors, the story is very compelling and worth reading. You can find English translations of it today, and we'll talk more about it in the future as well, because it's very influential upon Japanese culture. So overall, the Heian court grew increasingly stagnant and out of touch, removed from the realities of governing, out of touch with what was happening in the provinces, what was happening outside of Kyoto. So by now, much of the real state power is out of imperial hands, as court politics came to be largely manipulated by the powerful Fujiwara clan. And this is understandable if you think of it in simple terms of having handed out all of those tax-free shoen. The more of those shoen you hand out, the less taxable land you have, the less control over the land you have and the people who live there, and then the less money you have. So slowly the clans become more and more powerful than the imperial family. So this shoen practice has many repercussions throughout the history of Japan, both good and bad. All right, moving along. All right. So the Heian period was relatively peaceful, but as all good peacetimes go, they always come to an end. So outside the capital and the provinces, we have very powerful military forces developing. They were typically led by minor nobles, often sent on behalf of court-based major nobles to carry out tedious local administrative duties or to put out flames of rebellion. So let's say you have a court noble. He's enjoying his life in Kyoto, but somebody higher up than him doesn't like him. So what would often happen would be that they would be like, oh, I have assigned you to be the governor of such and such province, which happens to be like way out in the middle of nowhere. And that was like an attempt to get rid of him, right? So what that noble would do would go to a different noble and be like, hey, you're in charge of this now. You get to be the governor of this province for me, essentially, and then sends out the other person. So he gets to be the governor of that province while still living in the capital of Kyoto, essentially. So oftentimes this would particularly occur in northeast Japan, which was at the very edge of the court's sphere of influence. So you get a lot of people who are not really happy with the court living out there. And we also have distant imperial family members who were barred from succession claims. So if you had parts of the imperial family that they didn't want to gain the throne at all, they would basically cut them off. They would give them a new name, and they would send them off to some other provincial clan to be in charge of them. And obviously, these people were not super happy with that, and they were not big fans of the imperial court anymore. So they built up their own power. They recruited local warriors, and then later these people would become the samurai class of the feudal period. So there were two prominent and increasingly influential clans of these disenfranchised lesser nobles. The first is the Minamoto, also known as Genji, and yes, directly related to the tale of Genji, and the Taira, also known as Heike. And they did not like each other. So in 1156, they were employed, so each clan was employed to help rival claimants to the Fujiwara leadership. But these figures soon faded into the background when an all-out civil war developed between the Minamoto and the Taira. This is referred to as the Genpei War. So the Fujiwara was trying to control the throne, and then these two much more powerful clans essentially start to duke it out between each other, and ultimately they are going to fight for control over the imperial court. And you can see the wonderful peacetimes being completely destroyed by the Minamoto and the Taira here in this image. Alright. Moving along. So the Taira, let's see here. The Taira prevailed initially under the leadership of Kiyomori, who you see here in this image. He based himself in Heian-kyo, so he decided he was going to put himself right in Kyoto and really displaying that I'm in charge. He wants to show that he has the real power. So over the following 20 years, he becomes absorbed in courtly politics and society, and in 1180, he enables the enthroning of his 2-year-old grandson, Antoku, as emperor. So clearly he's like, this is mine, and I'm going to control this from now on. When a rival claimant requested the help of the Minamoto clan to get the throne back for himself, the Minamoto had spent 2 years regrouping, essentially, and they were ready to help him out. So their leader at this time was Yoritomo, and he is quite important. So both Kiyomori and the claimant died shortly after this conflict begins, but Yoritomo and his half-brother Yoshitsune continued the military campaign against the Taira. They wanted control over Japan, over the imperial court. So by 1185, Kyoto had fallen, and the Taira had been pursued to the western tip of Honshu. And that was the image that you saw previously, is that naval battle at the western tip of Honshu. And this is a detail of that image. So this is a battle called Dan-no-ura, and it was won by the Minamoto. So essentially, the Taira had this sort of short-term control over the imperial court, and the Minamoto came in and were like, no, absolutely not. So in a well-known tragic tale, Kiyomori's widow leapt into the sea with her grandson, Antoku. He was age 7 at the time, rather than to have him surrender. So a text called The Tale of Heike tells us about the Genpei War. It's rather written in rather legendary or epic terms, but it was compelled prior to 1330, so relatively closely to the actual, Genpei War occurrence. And it gives us great insight into these times. It's also an important source for many works of art and related literature, so we'll talk about the tale of Heike more, much like the tale of Genji. All right. Moving on. No. There we go. I was going to cut us off at Kamakura. All right. So next time that we meet, we'll talk about the Kamakura period, and we will continue our study of Japanese history. We'll get as far as we can in an hour and a half. We probably won't make it to modern day Japan, but we'll try. So thank you everyone for coming. I would raid, but I have something to do. So thank you for attending today's lecture, class, presentation. I appreciate everyone for coming, and I hope to see everyone here next time. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for visiting. The VOD will be up probably, should be right up after this if you want to review the content. So yeah, next time we'll start with Kamakura. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate everyone's attendance. See you again next time. Thank you for watching, everyone. Bye-bye.